Qatar has roughly the population of Kansas. It owns Harrods, the Shard, 17% of Volkswagen, 7% of the London Stock Exchange, Paris Saint-Germain, and enough Parisian real estate to rank among the largest private landowners in France. Abu Dhabi controls assets worth more than $1.5 trillion, more than the GDP of Spain. Saudi Arabia's public investment fund is targeting $2 trillion by 2030 and owns stakes in Uber, Nintendo, Boeing, and Live Nation. If you have a 401k or IRA, you already own pieces of companies these monarchies partly control. You are indirectly invested in kingdoms, and nobody told you. The sovereign wealth model begins with a problem every petrostate eventually faces. Oil runs out. A country built on hydrocarbons has an expiration date baked into the business model. The smart ones understood that early. They started converting barrels into financial assets that could keep generating returns long after the wells went dry. Kuwait got there first. The Kuwait Investment Authority, established in 1953, invested oil revenues abroad with a simple mandate: build a buffer for the post-oil future. That decision ended up saving the country in 1990. When Saddam Hussein invaded, Kuwait's domestic economy was physically wrecked. Oil fields were on fire. Banks were looted. Normal state function basically stopped. But the KIA's portfolio was sitting overseas, in London, New York, Singapore. Iraq could not reach it. The government in exile used those assets to pay salaries, fund the diplomatic coalition for liberation, buy weapons, and plan reconstruction. The KIA did not just protect wealth, it kept the country alive when the country no longer really existed at home. Every other Gulf monarchy saw the lesson immediately. Overseas sovereign wealth is not just diversification, it is sovereignty insurance. If war, revolution, or an oil price collapse destroys your domestic economy, your overseas portfolio keeps the state functioning. That is why Gulf funds do not invest purely for returns. They invest for survival. But survival is only the beginning of the story. What Abu Dhabi built after that is something much bigger than a rainy day fund. And at this scale, most Western investment institutions start to look small. Lisa Morimoto manages a mid-sized pension fund in Sacramento, overseeing retirement savings for about 12,000 California state employees. She recently traced her fund's indirect exposure to Gulf sovereign wealth. What she found surprised her. Through index funds, her retirees owned pieces of companies with major Abu Dhabi, Qatar, and Saudi stakes. Through her REIT allocation, they had exposure to European commercial real estate substantially owned by Gulf entities. Through her financial sector fund, they had exposure to banks, where Gulf sovereign funds were major shareholders. None of that showed up clearly in standard reporting. Her 12,000 retirees are indirectly invested in monarchies and have no idea. Lisa's surprise makes more sense once you look at the scale. Between ADIA, Mubadala, and ADQ, Abu Dhabi runs 3 sovereign vehicles with combined assets above $1.5 trillion. CalPERS, one of America's largest pension funds, manages about $450 billion. Abu Dhabi's 3 funds manage more than 3 times that. One emirate, not one country, one part of the UAE, with a citizen population of roughly 420,000. And Mubadala does not behave like a traditional wealth fund. When Abu Dhabi decided it wanted a semiconductor industry, it did not try to build one from scratch. It bought into global foundries, then used that position to pull in knowledge and develop domestic capability. Identify the sector you want, buy into established players, extract expertise, build at home. That is not passive investing. That is economic engineering. And the investment banks facilitating these acquisitions earn billions in advisory fees, structuring fees, and placement fees on every transaction. The Western financial system doesn't just tolerate Gulf sovereign wealth deployment, it profits from it at every stage. Abu Dhabi tends to operate quietly. Qatar and Saudi Arabia have been much more visible, and their strategies show a different kind of ambition entirely. Qatar Investment Authority has been the most visible buyer of Western trophy assets. Harrods, The Shard, Barclays, Canary Wharf, PSG. When French media mapped QIA's Paris property holdings, the footprint was comparable to major French insurance companies that had spent more than a century accumulating those positions. Qatar matched in 15 years what French institutions built in 100. The pattern: buy recognizable assets that deliver prestige, generate returns, and create positive brand association. Saudi Arabia's PIF is moving fastest. During the March 2020 pandemic sell-off, PIF deployed roughly $3.5 billion into US and European stocks in a matter of weeks. Boeing, Citigroup, Facebook, Disney, all near the lows. When you have $930 billion, every dip looks buyable. PIF also put $45 billion into SoftBank's Vision Fund, helping seed hundreds of companies from DoorDash to Uber. It bought Newcastle United for £305 million. It is financing NEOM, a planned $500 billion desert city. On paper, the strategy makes sense. Convert finite oil into permanent assets that fund diversification later. Whether Saudi Arabia can actually build a durable non-oil economy is uncertain. But every year of high oil prices gives it another chance to turn hydrocarbons into something longer lasting. And the football clubs are not vanity purchases. They are infrastructure. Abu Dhabi bought Manchester City in 2008 for £210 million. City Football Group now owns stakes in 13 clubs across 5 continents, valued at $4.8 billion. A 20 times return in 15 years. But the machine is not really about football. It is about soft power. Billion-person fan bases creating positive associations, relationships with political leaders, athletes functioning as informal ambassadors. When you control a global sports brand, you don't need to lobby governments. Governments come to you asking for tournaments, training facilities, and investment. The influence flows naturally from the asset. Calling that just sports washing misses the architecture entirely. Which brings you back to the question Lisa Morimoto found herself asking in Sacramento. How much of this is already inside your retirement account, and what exactly does that mean? Gulf sovereign funds collectively own roughly 2 to 4% of total market capitalization across major Western indices. That sounds small until you put it next to something familiar. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway owns roughly 1% of the S&P 500. Gulf funds collectively sit in the same league as one of the world's most powerful pools of capital. Except they answer to ruling families, not shareholders. If you own a broad market index fund, and statistically, if you have a 401k, you probably do, then you already have Gulf sovereign wealth exposure. Uber, Boeing, Citigroup, Disney, Nintendo. Your retirement account is geopolitical. Nobody flagged it, and the people who could have flagged it, the investment banks, the defense contractors, the financial centers lifted by Gulf capital, had too much to gain from not flagging it. If that just changed what you thought you owned in your retirement account, this is why the channel exists. We trace where your money actually sits, who controls it, and what happens when the assumptions underneath it shift. Subscribe if you want to see the next one before it surfaces. But here's the distinction that matters more than anything else in this video. Because there is a version of sovereign wealth that works with democratic accountability. Gulf funds are not that version. Norway's government pension fund Global is the world's largest at roughly $1.6 trillion. Its complete holdings are published online. Ethical guidelines are enforced by an independent council. The mandate is set by Parliament. Norwegian citizens can question their representatives about any investment, and those representatives can be voted out. Gulf funds operate under a fundamentally different system. Decisions are made by appointees who report to ruling families. Holdings are selectively disclosed. There is no democratic accountability. The mandates are tied to the strategic interests of states that have been credibly accused of serious human rights abuses. And influence at this scale does not require anyone to make an explicit demand. When PIF invested $3.5 billion in Lucid Motors and became the majority owner, Lucid announced a Saudi manufacturing facility. No formal quid pro quo was stated publicly, but when your largest shareholder is a sovereign government offering land, tax incentives, and guaranteed purchase orders, the factory location starts choosing itself. The dynamic extends beyond corporate boards. Western universities with Gulf endowment funding face questions about academic freedom regarding Middle Eastern politics. Media companies with Gulf shareholders navigate editorial independence in coverage of human rights. No explicit censorship, more like self-regulation shaped by shareholder awareness. It is almost impossible to prove any specific article was killed or any specific research was softened because of that dynamic. It is just as hard to pretend the dynamic does not exist. This is not classic corruption. It is something more difficult to regulate. Ambient influence from capital so large that it changes incentives without ever needing to issue an instruction. The time to build guardrails was before $3 trillion was deployed. That time is gone. The whole Gulf strategy depends on one giant assumption. Investment returns can eventually replace oil revenues. But the International Energy Agency projects oil demand plateauing in the late 2020s and declining through the 2030s. Once oil revenues start to fall, Gulf funds move from a model driven by new capital plus returns to a model driven by returns alone. Some may even become net sellers as governments start drawing down assets to cover deficits. Saudi Arabia already runs deficits when oil falls below $80 per barrel. PIF's domestic obligations for NEOM and Vision 2030 are massive. If oil revenue drops while those spending commitments stay in place, PIF may have to liquidate international holdings to keep funding the domestic transformation. The irony would be almost perfect. Funds built to survive the end of oil could end up being drawn down to finance the transition away from oil, becoming sellers of Western assets at exactly the moment markets assume they are permanent holders. And all of this rests on another assumption that may not hold: political stability. In 2017, Saudi Arabia's consolidation of power saw dozens of princes arrested. If a future succession fight erupts, sovereign funds could be used as internal weapons. The Arab Spring showed that populations can overthrow governments. Gulf states largely avoided that outcome through welfare spending and repression. But if revenues fall and governments can no longer sustain the spending, stability becomes less certain. Lisa's retirees are not modeling any of this. Neither is your 401k. The assumption of Gulf stability is priced into all of it. By 2030, Gulf sovereign wealth funds could collectively control more than $5 trillion in global assets, about the size of Japan's entire GDP. Controlled by monarchies, governing populations smaller than most American cities, answerable to no parliament, no electorate, and no outside audit. Gulf funds have generally behaved like patient, long-term investors. Capital is capital, and when Western companies needed it, Gulf money showed up. That deserves honest acknowledgement. But Gulf funds are not Norway. They operate under monarchs. Decisions are made without democratic constraint. The ambient influence that kind of capital creates can reshape corporate boards, university research, media coverage, and government policy without a single direct demand ever being made. $3 trillion today, potentially $5 trillion by 2030, already in your index fund. Already shaping decisions, already creating influence without instructions. The arrangement works for everyone involved right now. The real question is what happens when it stops working. And at $5 trillion, controlled by monarchies with no democratic accountability, that is a question worth asking before the answer arrives on its own.